to the School of Astrology on the US presidential elections 2020 and on the question Trump or Biden. So let's first look at the timeline of the presidential elections this year. On November 3rd, we have General Election Day, and between November 4 and December 14, the counting of popular votes will take place. Then December 14, the electors vote, and January 20 would then be Inauguration Day. So let's first look at the chart and the prospects of Donald Trump. The birth chart that we see here heavily leans onto the east, what is the left side of the chart. If you have followed our video on reading a birth chart, you will remember that a full left side would mean that their life is mostly about the individual himself, not about the others. The others would be to the west or to the right in the chart. So now how do we go about the interpretation when it's about winning or losing an election? The first thing we want to look at is the transits of election day. So what do we see here? With elections, we always check the moon because in the mundane astrology, the moon represents the people. So now here, the moon is in the sign of Donald Trump's sun and Uranus, his highest planets. That per se would mean that there are a lot of people endorsing his type of leadership style. This does not give away if the number of people endorsing will be sufficient. Per se, it would just be much. The next thing that we see is the current constellation of Jupiter, Pluto and Saturn in close vicinity, a constellation that has been with us throughout the corona crisis. And it can actually be called something like a typical constellation pointing at the current condition of difficulty, restriction, economic downturn, and more. This very constellation is in opposition to the birth Saturn and Venus of Mr. Trump. And typically the interpretation here would be rather unfavorable. But also here, this constellation has been around for a while, and many people are affected by it over a longer period of time. It's also here we shouldn't consider this a decisive indicator. In fact, this constellation affects everyone currently, but everyone in a different way, of course, given the birth chart. What else do we see in the transits? We find Mercury representing the public opinion in a square to the Saturn-Venus conjunct of Mr. Trump, which would be a mild indication of disagreement. Also nothing spectacular here because, of course, not everyone would agree with the president at any time. And then we would still see Venus as an appreciation received from the outside that meets Mr. Trump's Neptune here. This will translate into an interpretation that people love or admire him, even in a type of romantic fashion because of the conjunct to the birth Neptune. In actual effect, when we admire Neptune in another person, we admire a projection, not the real thing or the real person, but the image we have of the person instead. Whenever we look at the Neptune of someone with a planet from the outside, we see ourselves, but not the real personality of the other one. It would be hidden behind Neptune. Now, seeing that we didn't find any concrete indications in the transit of election day, we will resort to the secondary progressions next. Without going into much detail, just to briefly explain what is a secondary progression and why we look at it, we use secondary progressions as a slow motion type of horoscope and assistance chart, as we call it, to better judge just the main life events and not the nitty-gritty detail of every day. In order to compare findings, let's first look at the secondary progressions at the time of the last election on 8 November 2016. Here we see that the progressive midheaven is on the verge of changing signs, which means that the career of the individual enters a completely new phase shortly after the elections. Another indication of a win at the elections is that the progressive sun already had changed signs and so already entered into an entirely new phase of life. Now let's look at the secondary progression for this year's election day. Interestingly enough, the progressive midheaven has moved on and is now just past the progressive Saturn. This would actually be a clear indication that a career path would end, and sometime after a new one would commence. Just from this strong indicator alone, we can say that winning this election could be very difficult, if not impossible. We also see that the people represented by the moon in the progressive chart are in a tension, indicated by the square to the Sun and Uranus of the birth chart. But a lot of things can happen after election day. The Electoral College will cast its vote on 14 December. Since the progressions are not going to change significantly within the short time until 14 December, we will look at the transit again. One core thing catches the eye here. A very powerful support from Pluto in transit supports the career of Mr. Trump with a trine. This is in a way powerful that it could be even an indication of a change of fortune. The next key day will be 20th January to 2021, Inauguration Day. Nothing much changes here because Pluto is so slow. The trine just becomes more exact. To summarize, the condition in the progressions with midheaven arriving at Saturn would typically outrule anything that reads continuation of career. In any case, this would be a major disruption. Typically, Saturn would stand for an end in this case. But the trine of Pluto in the transits later placed a little doubt on whether the tables could be turned. Now we also need to look at the chart of Joe Biden, of course. So here we have his chart. As an indicator of a leader, we find Pluto at the start of the 9th house in a distant trine to the rising, which would indicate the person of power. A person of power that, because of this trine, uses power harmoniously. But we are not here to analyze the birth chart, but the prospects in the election. So here we can take a look at the transits on November 3rd. We see the current constellation with Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn that we've pointed out just earlier in a sextile to the Sun, Venus, and Mercury of Mr. Biden. This would indicate that the current situation could tilt the scales in his favor. On the other hand, this is not enough for a clear indication of a win or lose. So here we look at the secondary progression. Now we don't find any of the axis change signs as with Mr. Trump, but an indication that the people indicated by the moon here are in conjunct with the progressive Venus, which would indicate public support for everything that is kind-hearted and nice, because both planets are in Pisces and this would be their quality there. So it looks as if the public wasn't looking for fights, but looking for peace at this time. Seeing that both planets are in the first progressive house of Mr. Biden, he seems to represent this quality at this time. Other than that, we see Saturn and Uranus close to the descendant here, but overall, in both cases, too far away from the actual degree of the descendant. In the progressions, we typically apply at max 1 degree deviation from the exact aspect. So both aren't current and won't be considered, therefore. So now, is this enough to remove all doubt? No. Also here, the transit on 14 December and 20th January matter. In the transit on 14 December, we see a tension of Mercury to midheaven and also a square of Uranus to Pluto. Both indicate a disruptive debate and condition at the time. Pluto would typically win against Uranus, but the disruption will be significant. In the transit on 20th January, the disruption would be aided by Mars joining Uranus here. So there will be a lot of mean discussion and attacks be going on. But again, Pluto won't be impressed because it's the stronger force here and would also win out in this case. What we also see here is a sextile of Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter to the rising, which is very stabilizing. Since this doesn't look like an easy win, just to be sure, let's look at Kamala Harris's progressions as well. Here we see the popular vote represented by the progressive moon in conjunct with the progressive Jupiter in a trine to the stellium of Uranus, Pluto, and Venus, respectively the progressive Uranus, Pluto, and Mars. The progressive rising in Leo would point us to the ruler Sun, and here we see that the Sun has progressed so far in this lifetime that it now enters the visible sky above the horizon. All this would be a powerful indication for a win. We didn't find a birth time for Mike Pence, and without it, neither the transits nor the progressions we checked that show anything significant that would contribute to more clarity here. So we leave it for this time and won't analyze that further. All right, so here we made our conclusion that from the chart and forecasting analysis, we would say Joe Biden would win this election. Well then, let's check back in November, December, and January. We hope you find useful content on this channel and appreciate your feedback. Thanks for your comments. Please also comment what interests you. We will try to cater to the most requested themes first. Please subscribe to stay updated with free content every Sunday. And remember to activate notifications to be informed about new content. Thank you for your interest and see you again soon on this channel.